ladies and gentlemen. Here we are. And welcome to Unit 4 AP US History. And we will begin our lecture right away. I like to call this the periods in history most people don't care about but should. And let's begin. We'll be talking about the time period from 1830s to the 1840s, birth of the second party system, manifest destiny, and a few other good things like that. So let's get right into the politics of it. Let's talk about the 1836 election. And we start with this fellow here, Martin Van Buren. He will be actually, in a sense, appointed by Andrew Jackson. This was unusual and controversial, but it really seemed clear that Andrew Jackson was the puppeteer pulling the strings behind his little Martin Van Buren, which does not help Van Buren at all, this appearance, this idea. Who was this guy, Martin Van Buren? He had a nickname. They called him Old Kinderhook. Some people believe that's where the expression OK actually comes from. He had other nicknames like the Wizard of Albany, the Little Magician. He's our first president who's actually born under the United States flag. Everybody else was born when we were an English colony up till this fellow. He's also the first president for whom English was not the first language. He actually spoke Dutch in his home. We're going to do a little test to make sure everything is working, and it appears to be. And let me make sure that you can see me all right. Looks like you can, but most importantly, let's get right back into the screen. He's going to run in 36. Oh, we have to do the little effects again, sorry. He's going to run in 1836 against, in a unique strategy, the Whig Party, that's Whig with a W-H-I-G, are going to have what they call the favorite son strategy. So there's going to be a bunch of guys, William Henry Harrison and Daniel Webster, and actually a few other characters as well. The idea is in each region, run your popular guy so that there's not enough electoral votes for anybody, and the Whigs had a control of Congress, so then they'd get to choose who they wanted. Well, how did this strategy fare for the Whigs? Not so well. If you look at the map here, actually let's get an even bigger version of it, you can see that it's Van Buren against Harrison and White and Webster and Magnum. And each of these guys is still not able to block Van Buren from getting both a majority in the electoral vote and in the popular vote. So he manages to pull it out and get himself elected president. But once he becomes president, the Little Magician is going to have some difficult times. Lots of things, of course, will happen during his presidency. You can note a few of them here. And remember, one of the great advantages of these video lectures is that you can stop me whenever you'd like, pause, rewind, go back and forward, take notes. I'm not going to talk about everything on this little chart here, but what I'd like to highlight is that we think of Van Buren's presidency as being pretty much nothing but trouble. He is going to have one difficult thing after another. The Canadian Rebellion of the 1830s is going to be a difficult political international affairs issue for him. There's going to be anti-slavery agitation, and we'll talk about the Amistad case in just a second. And we're going to deal with a major economic crisis, America's worst depression to date. This is going to be a real big challenge for President Van Buren. But let's just tell you a few details about some of these issues. Of course, the major economic crisis that we're going to talk about, equivalent of a depression, Panic of 1837, the Amistad incident. Let's talk about that. 1839, these are not necessarily in order, but this is an epic moment in the anti-slavery movement. The Amistad, you can see the painting on the left of your screen, was an incredible story of a group of slaves who had been illegally traded from Africa to Cuba. This was when the transatlantic slave trade was already officially illegal. And then when they were transferred from Cuba, from one part of Cuba to another aboard a ship, they rose up and actually killed the slave masters, all except for a handful, who then forced to sail them back home to Africa. But these guys at night, the sailors were clever enough that instead of going back to Africa, they steered north, thinking that they could be helped in America. Cinque, or Sengbe, as was his real name, was the leader of the slave rebellion, and eventually they were captured by the U.S. Coast Guard, and eventually from there they were brought to trial multiple times until they eventually reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court. There is a great film that was made about this. I highly recommend if you like to watch historical films, even if you don't. It's one of my all-time greatest movies. I don't think we're going to have time to watch it this year as a part of the class. But these freed slaves, or these escaped slaves, will go through district courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, well, let me show you the preview, basically, that shows you kind of what happened. It's a great preview of a great film. First, the movie opens with the dramatic escape. Bondage taking over the ship. Amistad is the name of the ship.
They were first detained by officers of a survey brig off the coast of Long Island. Can only assume that the charge is murder.
We do hereby claim salvage on the high seas of the Spanish ship La Amistad and all her cargo.
Your Honor, here are the true owners of these slaves.
These slaves, Your Honor, are by rights the property of Spain.
You and this young so-called lawyer have proven you know what they are. They're Africans. Congratulations. What you don't know is who they are.
This could take us all one long step closer to civil war.
Immediately surrender these goods!
Our president has appealed the decision to our Supreme Court.
They actually won in district court, and then
We have to try the case again.
I will call into the past and beg my ancestors to come and help me, for at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
This is the most important case ever come before this court. Because what it in fact concerns is freedom, the very nature of man. And the proof is the length to which a man will go to regain it once taken. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices, to get home.
That's former President John Quincy Adams, who is the lawyer who takes the case in the Supreme Court. Amazing movie. Please watch it. Incredible action. Anyways, let's talk for just a minute about the Panic of 1837. You see the cartoon on the right that shows homeless, unemployed, people lining up looking for work. It was a catastrophic time in American history. What happened here? We had a combination of this land mania, this desire for people to get rich quick, gambling literally with bank money on Western lands. Combine that with what was known as the Hessian fly, which was this bug that took out the wheat crop that year. So there was a food crisis. Prices were skyrocketing. Mobs were taking over cities practically. And then finally you throw in a European economic crisis, which really shows us even back then the sort of globalized nature of our markets. All of this comes together. And don't forget that the president before, Andrew Jackson, had destroyed the bank. And so you have this total economic crisis. Everything falls apart. Unemployment, banks crash, really a massive crisis. Van Buren attempts to solve things with what he calls the divorce bill. This is a law that's goal is to keep the government out of banking, to create an independent treasury. This is actually kind of what we have today, but at that point it was not popular yet. People were still fighting and trying to decide if we should go back to the bank or the Bank of the U.S. or what we should do. So he does pass into effect this independent treasury, but then it'll come and get kicked out by the next president. It's going to come back and forth over the next couple of years. Which brings us right into the famous election of 1840. This is a really important election in terms of the progress of politics and the way things happen today. This was known as the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign, the Log Cabin and Hard Cider election. It gets that name based on a little goof made by the Democratic Party, the Van Buren folks, that then becomes the basis of the guys running against them. In your notes, I have Martin Van Ruin, that was his nickname, Martin Van Buren for the Democrats, and he's running with his vice presidential candidate, Johnson. Not too important to know him. And they'll be running against this fellow who we've already seen once before, William Henry Harrison, better known as Old Tippecanoe, because he was the hero of the war or the battle against Native Americans at Tippecanoe Creek. And he's his vice presidential candidate, John Tyler, who will play a pretty key role later. This is the Whig Party. This campaign wasn't about issues hardly at all. The Whigs did not want to publish a platform. They didn't want to be stuck to anything. They went with Harrison for his popularity. He was a war hero. He was well known and well loved, and they had the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Basically, a nice little rhyme that told you nothing about what they stood for. It was called a Huzzah for Harrison campaign. Right, you can see here on this flag, William Henry Harrison, the Ohio farmer with his little log cabin. Now, the log cabin, I have to explain the story, comes from a real foolish insult. I don't even know who it was. It wasn't Van Buren. It was somebody on his campaign or in his administration. In a newspaper editorial, described Harrison as sort of a poor farmer eking out an existence in a log cabin drinking his cider. Cider was, of course, the backcountry drink that was quite popular. And instead of being ashamed of this image of the log cabin and the cider drinker, they embrace it. Their whole campaign surrounds it. And that's kind of the insanity of it, right? I mean, you've got this image in your mind. They were trying to paint them, even though it's the party of Jackson, the Democrats, were trying to say the other guys were too lowbrow. They were too low class. They were a bunch of wild log cabin cider drinking partiers. But all of a sudden, it turns the other way. Right? And so you see in this cartoon, stop the barrel, Martin Van Buren is running and the hard cider is rolling after him. The Harrison campaign totally adopts, everywhere you look, you can see the log cabin, because they said that we are the man of the people. It was like a gift from the Democratic Party, because, of course, the party of Jackson used to be the party of the people. So the Whigs are thrilled for this, to have this new advantage. And the irony there is that Mr. Harrison is not a log cabin farmer. He's not some country bumpkin. He's from the first families of Virginia. He's an upper-class elitist, just as much, in fact, as Van Buren was. But it didn't matter. It was all about the hoopla and the insanity of the campaign. This is my favorite. These were flip cards or pull cards. You would have your Martin Van Buren as the aristocrat drinking his fancy brandy. And then if you pulled the card, suddenly he was drinking William Henry Harrison's cider and his eyes rolled up in disgust. Clearly not a man of the people, right? And then finally, one last cartoon. It shows the hard cider log cabin train rolling forward towards the wagon of Martin Van Buren, and he just cannot withstand what's going on. It's the change of it's the way of the future, really. And here's your election results. It's a close election, right? It's 234 electoral votes to 60. But in terms of the popular vote, well, even the popular vote, I suppose we'll give this one as a pretty clear one for Harrison, right? Because he's got about 7 percentage points. And there's a little guy appearing there, Liberty Party. That's James Burney, who just gets 7,000 votes. Doesn't make a huge splash, but he'll play a pretty key role in the next election. But we'll get to that in just a moment. This election is huge because it really shows us some major changes in elections that are still with us to this day. We've got this populist, democratic style of campaigning, right? Aristocracy out and democracy is it. You've got to be a man of the people. Politicians now have to quote one historian, unbend and curry favor with the voting masses. You have to appeal to the people. You have to let them know also that you're a man of the people. Most high offices, the reality, of course, who's getting elected was leading citizens, the educated, wealthy elite, but They couldn't act like a fancy, highfalutin Van Buren with his brandy. They needed to cultivate a common touch. They needed to show, again, truly, that they were men of the people, that they could understand what the common man said. And to this day, we see that in elections. How much is a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk is a question that's posed to just about every candidate since the 1900s. We also, or in your notes, they referred to what's called king numbers. You might recall that we had King Caucus, where the caucus of congressional senators and House of Representatives folks would choose the candidate. And now they had this expression that where one guy said, the divine right of the king has been replaced by the divine right of the people. That democracy itself can become its own form of tyranny, that the numbers, whoever has the numbers wins, and so all that matters is currying favor with the people. The second, of course, important point is we now have a durable two-party system. And this is also when we call this era the second party system, because we now have Whigs and Democrats. And of course, we no longer have the Whigs today, but they will gradually morph and evolve and turn into the Republicans. But we'll get to that later. Let's take a pause, and now that we've got our new president, William Henry Harrison, actually, I will say one more thing, and then I'll take my pause. The two parties that we've got the Democrats, and that right now they stand essentially for states' rights, government restraint, small government, anti-privilege, even though they lost that claim in that last election. And the Whigs are the strong federal government. They've sort of inherited the ideas of the Federalists of old. They really believed in using strong government to improve society. They continue to embrace Henry Clay and his American system, that whole thing of banks, tariffs, and infrastructure. Now, you'll recall that William Henry Harrison won the election, and he will proceed to give the longest inauguration speech in history. He stood on that balcony for 2 hours in the pouring rain. He manages to catch pneumonia and die shortly thereafter. That's right, 31 days as the president, the all-time shortest term, and all of a sudden, John Tyler is more than just a rhyme. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. He is now, in fact, President of the United States. I'm going to hit stop, and you can go to the next part of this lecture shortly. Thank you.